Support for 10,000 Things comes from Third Place Books. With 3 store locations in Seattle, Washington, Third Place Books offers a wide selection of books, gifts, and over 250 author readings a year, in-store or online at thirdplacebooks.com.
Hi, it's Terry Gross, the host of Fresh Air. We bring you in-depth, long-form interviews with actors, directors, musicians, authors, journalists, and more. Listen to our Peabody Award-winning Fresh Air podcast from WHYY and NPR.
There are a lot of things that we just don't see until something happens that requires that we reassess our reality. We're forced to confront a new truth. At that moment, we're offered a choice, to remain ignorant or to evolve. And that choice can put everything we've known at risk.
I think that's what's hard about the Asian community is that they were there to support me during that moment, but they were not there to support me after that moment.
Part of growing up in the shadow of the model minority myth is the false belief that if you work hard and keep your head down, that you'll have the same shot at the American dream as the next white guy. As people of color, we may make ourselves a little smaller, mold ourselves around an ideal of a hardworking citizen and taxpayer, believing that if we follow the rules closely and earn our pedigree, that we too can have that house with a white picket fence. But let's say you step outside of that script for just a moment. Make a decision that can be judged as less than perfect. Something that you do brands you as being an outlier. And a narrative begins to develop around who you are. A narrative that doesn't conform with the reality of your circumstances. That would have you believe that you've transgressed social conventions or insist that you've violated the norms. The people who you have known and trusted begin to question whether or not you belong in their community.
What happens to one happens to all. You can't really bury your head in the sand and hope that the problems won't happen to you if you do all the right things. That's not a way to stay safe. Good is no guarantee of safety.
Janet Lee grew up in a close-knit Catholic community in Anaheim, California. She was fairly sheltered as a young Korean-American girl. When she was 18 years old, Janet was falsely accused of a crime and put in jail. The experience was traumatic. It broke her connection with her family, and it created a gulf between Janet and her community. But Janet found a way to bring herself back from the brink by suing the Philadelphia Police Department.
It wasn't until I did start standing up for myself that I was able to start getting better.
This is 10,000 Things, a podcast about modern-day artifacts of Asian American life and the stories they reveal. I'm Shin-Yi Pai. Today, a settlement.
Support for 10,000 Things comes from Third Place Books. With 3 store locations in Seattle, Washington, Third Place Books offers a wide selection of books, gifts, and over 250 author readings a year, in-store or online at thirdplacebooks.com.
What does it mean to live a good life? On the acclaimed podcast No Small Endeavor, produced by Great Feeling Studios and PRX, theology professor Lee C. Camp explores this question every week, sitting down with courageous and impassioned people from all walks of life, like Hollywood legend Rob Reiner and New York Times bestselling author Gretchen Rubin. Like our show, the podcast covers intimate stories from the past and future, from conversations on cultural Korean beauty standards with TED Talks daily host Elise Hu, to discussions on how our religious differences should be treasured with Interfaith America founder Eboo Patel. Together, they'll figure out what it means to find true happiness and how we can all flourish in our day-to-day life. Don't miss out. Follow No Small Endeavor on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. In the fall of 2003, Janet was 18 years old and a first-generation college student. She was a freshman at Bryn Mawr College in Philadelphia. It was her first time living away from home.
I was working maybe 1.5 jobs at that time, just busy with work and school.
She was getting ready to go home for the winter break after having survived the fall semester and a week of finals. Her dormitory mates were getting crafty.
Our hall organizer, she had us come together and we created stress relievers.
Stress relievers. Yeah, what's a stress reliever?
It's, just like a squishy ball, but it was made out of condoms filled with flour.
That was the start of a chain of events that would change Janet's life forever.
I think that was like the last thing that we did before folks started leaving for the holidays as a way to celebrate the end of finals.
Janet threw the condoms into the suitcase she was packing for Christmas back home in California. She thought she might give them as quirky white elephant gifts to her friends.
I was sitting at the airport waiting for my flight, and I heard a voice over the loudspeakers asking for a passenger by the name of Janet Lee to come to the counter.
Janet wasn't allowed to board the plane that night. Instead, she approached the desk and was taken into a side room away from the departure gate.
And there was a policeman who asked, you have something in your bag that you weren't supposed to.
Janet mentally ran through the contents of her bag. She was confused.
Maybe my curling iron had too much metal in it, or maybe I had too much liquid. And then they were like, nope, neither of those things. And then that's when I realized, oh, it's the balls of flour. At that point, they handcuffed me and took me to a police station in West Philadelphia to test those condoms filled with flour.
The police took away the stress-relieving condoms to test them for drugs. Janet missed her flight home. They booked her into the police station. They took her mugshot, they took her belongings, and they had her remove her shoelaces in case she thought of harming herself.
In my head, I felt like, oh, this is all a misunderstanding. I'll go home soon.
Janet was given one phone call, and she called her parents, which was not easy.
I was so embarrassed to call my parents. I had to tell them, I'm sorry, I touched condoms.
Janet told her parents about the misunderstanding and said that, unfortunately, she had to miss her flight, but she hoped to be back at the airport soon.
My mom instantly started crying.
There was a lot of confusion. Janet was still worried about missing her flight, or worse, burdening her parents with legal fees. It was a difficult conversation. Today, it's still hard for Janet to think about the deep distress that her phone call caused her parents. Their pain and her shame combining together. It was a turning point in their relationship. Things get hazy in Janet's memory after that. She waited in a cell for the results of the drug test. There was one toilet in the cell, completely out in the open, no privacy. She remembers feeling very out of her element. People around her were acting out their own anguish. Some made a lot of noise about it. She had no way to make sense of what was happening. Janet passed the time trying to keep to herself. Different staff walked by her cell, giving her casual updates about her situation.
Someone walked by and said that they found opium.
Later, she received her arrest warrant, which said the condoms contained amphetamines.
And then by the time I got to a judge that evening, it was for cocaine.
She was given a public defender and was called before a judge for a preliminary hearing. Janet was in shock. She says they wouldn't let her speak and didn't ask her for her version of events. The judge made their decision. Janet was charged with intent to transport drugs across state lines, and bail was set at $500,000. Her family didn't have the money to post bail, so Janet had to remain incarcerated. She would remain locked up until everything was sorted out. Back in California, her parents scrambled. They contacted their parish, who called the Catholic Church in Philadelphia. They connected Janet's family with a lawyer. The attorney was a no-nonsense Korean-American guy. He had been a DA. He was unflappable. This was not his first rodeo. He showed up within the first 24 hours. By this time, Janet had been moved to a different facility with a whole new group of inmates. She was the only Asian American.
It was me and I want to say almost 80% Black women. So everyone definitely remembered me.
And everyone was older. It was a frightening place to be. Sometimes the environment included men.
I'd see some of the men walk by and they would do things like throw themselves against the plexiglass. I knew they couldn't hit me, but it's still scary when you see someone just coming at you through the plexiglass.
More often, she was in a cell block of only women.
I feel like the women, for the most part, were pretty supportive of each other. Obviously, certain people were not as safe, but like, I feel like most of the people there just were moms who missed their kids.
After the lawyer showed up in a suit and tie, Janet was seen in a new light amongst her fellow inmates.
Everyone thought I was a kingpin, and I was treated with great respect, which I'm grateful for.
Was that a big deal for your parents to get a lawyer?
Oh my God. I think that was the thing that I was most worried about.
Yeah.
And, you know, he did it pro bono, which I'm very grateful for. But I think maybe the church might have also helped out.
The lawyer was the first one to really try to understand what was going on.
He was like, well, did you do it? You can tell me the truth. And I was like, I didn't do it. And he was like, okay, well, just so you know, the way these drug tests work, they don't come up for multiple drugs. Opium is not similar at all to amphetamines.
Janet's lawyer knew that something was fishy because the police had given multiple results for one drug test. He immediately put in a request to retest. Janet was relieved to see someone step in and demand more information. He wasn't taking the police's story at face value.
He was like, well, did they call your school? Like, did they confirm your story? Like, did they not notice that there's 3 different drugs listed on different pieces of paper?
Janet didn't see anyone else looking deeper or questioning things that failed to line up, like how multiple drugs would come up in the test, or if flour had been mistaken for drugs. Most people thought the police have no reason to lie. The tests don't lie. Janet must be lying.
And, you know, when everyone doubts you, you start to doubt yourself too.
Janet knew that she had put the flour in the condoms, but the gaslighting that she was experiencing made her mind spin.
You start going down this path, like trying to make this alternative reality fit.
The horrific environment, the curtain of shame, and the way that reality was crumbling was a lot for young Janet to endure.
Understanding how hard it is to like stand in your truth and to believe in the things that you know to be true when everyone else is telling you that they're not.
And you're like an 18-year-old Asian American girl, you know,
who has been taught to be obedient. But at the end of the day, I was right. They were wrong.
But until she could prove this, Janet would remain in jail, which was a world away from the Korean American Catholic community she grew up in. Janet's childhood had sheltered her from many ugly things in the world. She had been taught to listen to authority figures. She had no clue that transporting drugs and condoms was a common practice among drug mules.
And then I got to learn all about all the common tactics to transport things or steal things.
Janet spent Christmas Day in jail. She remained incarcerated on New Year's. Jail was a loud and chaotic environment that felt deeply stark, a place that would put anyone in fight or flight mode. It was bleak. Janet felt numb, and she wasn't eating much, and that started to feel good, as if she could assert control over at least one small element of her experience.
It felt like a way to sort of prove to them that I didn't need anything from them.
During the day, Janet mostly tried to keep to herself. She stayed in her cell as much as possible, but there was no privacy, and other than crime dramas on TV or romance novels, there was nothing to do but talk. Janet's life was different from the lives of her fellow inmates, but she listened to them.
Every single one of them wanted their stories heard. I think they just wanted to be seen as people, and they wanted to know that they had some sort of agency.
Three weeks after her arrest, Janet was released. The charges against her were dropped. The retest of the drugs had found nothing. She was free to go home, but Janet was changed. Changed by what she had personally experienced and changed by what she had witnessed. She wasn't pure or innocent or a little girl anymore, and what she had seen and experienced was both unexpected and unsettling. Janet left her cell with the imprint of what she had felt and what she had seen on her mind and in her body, and the realization that the world was not what she thought it was.
There was this parallel world, and when you slip through the cracks, you fall from one world to the next. And there's this myth that if you do everything right, you can stay in the safe world, but that is a myth. And once you fall, there's no safety net.
Janet's time in jail was an emotionally traumatic ordeal for an 18-year-old to endure. She had a lot to process. She had the whiff of scandal about her, and though she wasn't overtly shunned by her community in any obvious way, no one wanted to talk about the elephant in the room and Janet's experience. People can have a habit of focusing on pleasant news. Who's engaged? Who has a new job? Who's bought a new house? In the absence of more socially acceptable news, Janet became a kind of ghost.
I immediately felt like afterwards, like I was no longer perfect. I had this mar.
Her relationship with her mom became strained.
I remember one of the first things she said to me when I got out was, "Great, now you'll never get married."
Janet understood her mom's parental concern with reputation and saving face. Asian American parents love to compare their kids and their over-accomplishments to one another. In fact, it can be a very particular kind of competition amongst immigrant parents. Everyone wants bragging rights, but the flip side of that is the shame of having a kid who underperforms or disappoints social expectation. Janet didn't feel ashamed of being falsely accused, of committing a crime, or being incarcerated. She hadn't done anything wrong. So Janet started to pull away from her parents and her church. She found herself avoiding phone calls from home.
They were both integral to me getting out of prison, but at the same time, there was a lot of shame that I was in prison at all.
She also felt like an outsider in the Asian American community. The protective instinct in the community to shut down or avoid shameful and ugly narratives felt disingenuous to her. Janet didn't fit neatly into the community's narrative or expectation of what an Asian American daughter should be or do anymore. She had experienced something incomprehensible, and she could no longer perform the identity that they expected from her, nor relate to people who couldn't fully accept her.
I don't know that I ever had a big group of Asian American friends again after that, because it was so tied up with the church and sort of being in this bubble and feeling sort of comfortable all the time. And I had very uncomfortable views and emotions after that.
She was dealing with a lot of emotions that made people uncomfortable. Many people prefer to skate on the surface of things and not go terribly deep. Janet was thinking through a lot of tough questions about the world, like what the world thinks of Asian American women, that they are powerless, and she was also thinking about racism, sexism, victimhood, corruption, and structural violence, stuff that our communities don't always like to admit are real. Because to allow space for those narratives and other versions of reality would mean that the American dream is really not what our parents thought it would be, not what they thought when they immigrated and gave up family, culture, language, and home, and basically everything to come to a new country that has its problems. Janet wanted to talk openly about social issues that made other people feel awkward. She wanted to have deep connection with others thinking about the same things, but her Asian American friends didn't want to meet her in that place of need. So she felt less and less like a perfect student or a dutiful daughter. The model minority identity began to fall away. She was questioning the foundations of the community she was raised in, questioning how she had gone so long without knowing that things like drugs and racism and inequality and police misconduct exist. And now that she knew, she couldn't go back.
Like once you see, you can never unsee it.
So Janet did what she could to cope. She threw herself back into the familiar demands of schoolwork. She studied comparative literature, reading about other folks who have been imprisoned or suppressed by systems of power. She read and wrote about justice, grief, and finding dignity after trauma.
I was so desperate to feel less lonely and to have a way to understand and process that experience.
There weren't many people she could talk to who understood, but she could find relief in books that let her examine injustice from a safe distance.
My major was basically therapy.
Janet also started to find more comfort in her ability to control and limit her food intake, just like she had in jail. And this need to assert control spiraled.
I started controlling who I would see and who I wouldn't see because it would involve food.
Janet even started to limit her activities and socializing so that she wouldn't be around food and people eating food.
And then I realized that I had effectively put myself back in prison of my own making.
Janet needed to speak out. She had to assert for herself that she mattered, and to move the pain out of her body somatically, to take her life and mind and body back.
My family wanted me to forget about it, pretend like it never happened, and just move on with my life. But I just couldn't, I physically could not do that.
Janet decided to sue the Philadelphia Police Department. Janet's lawyer was again there to help. From their perspective, either the police's drug test was faulty or someone had manufactured the test results on purpose. Janet was released because the condoms contained only flour. Detaining her and charging her for drugs was wrong. This shouldn't have happened, and it shouldn't have taken so long to resolve. It turns out that many other people had negative things to say about their experiences with the police. Accusations of police negligence or corruption was not uncommon. Janet joined a class action lawsuit with other people like her who had suffered from Philadelphia police misconduct. Again, her mom couldn't offer much support.
She found it hard to understand why I was doing a lawsuit and why I couldn't just move on.
The lawsuit sought damages for pain and suffering against the Philadelphia Police Department, financial loss, and emotional distress. And Janet and her lawyer had to quantify the negative impact Janet had experienced at the hands of the police. They had to come up with a number that her suffering was worth. They often based these numbers on projected earnings, how someone's future salary might be impacted.
It was hard to determine what my projected earnings would be because I was a college student, but for a lot of the other women who had been in prison with me, it's even harder because they were unemployed or they were on parole. So their projected earnings were so low that it wasn't worth doing a class action.
As time went on, the other plaintiffs fell away. The stories of their lives had more complicating factors. Janet was the only one with a spotless record that could hold up to intense scrutiny in court. But it was somewhat impossible to put a price on the damage she'd endured. She had a hard time admitting that she had been deeply impacted. It felt like admitting that what had happened to her had in fact caused harm.
I think it's easier to just kind of move on and say everything happens for the best. And it's hard to be in that place where it's this wasn't for the best. And this has damaged me irreparably.
How do you feel about that young Janet Lee now?
It's hard to think about. I think I can feel myself getting cold and upset when I think about it, and I think it's easier for me to not actually think about what happened to her.
Janet received some needed validation at an unexpected moment in the bureaucratic process. The police department's lawyers sent a psychologist to evaluate her, to assess her mental state. He asked a lot of probing questions about Janet's life in the years after her arrest.
At the end of it, he told me, "Hey, you're a good kid." And I just started crying because I stopped believing that. When you're in prison, everyone treats you like you're a criminal. The entire time in a lawsuit, they're trying to make it your fault. They're trying to find all these reasons why you're wrong, why you made this happen, why you deserved this. And it was a relief to have someone tell me that.
Janet's lawyer asked for a dollar amount that would cover grad school, a tangible next step that would help her advance. Some news outlets picked up the story and the pressure ramped up. Presumably, the Philadelphia Police Department wanted to minimize damage to their reputation, so they offered a settlement. The police never had to explain their actions in court. The settlement that Janet received was $180,000. The lawsuit was over. The settlement was a win, but it didn't bring the closure that Janet had hoped for. Money couldn't erase what happened, or take away the pain and indignity or the shame. This wasn't normal money to be spent on food and clothes or a new car. This was restitution. It was also a lot of money for a college kid to suddenly come into. Sometimes the money felt like a burden. She wanted it to be spent on something meaningful, something that might justify her horrible experience. She spent some of the money to pay off her parents' debt. As an Asian daughter, your very birth into this life as a female creates a situation of indebtedness to your parents. That debt can never be fully repaid, but a large cash gift might make a dent in it. At other times, the money really gave Janet a newfound sense of freedom. It gave her new choices.
During that time when I still had that money, I felt very empowered to do a lot of things, and I haven't felt that empowered since.
The settlement money gave Janet something she had never had before, the ability to consider what she alone wanted to do. It gave her independence. It gave her support. It gave her a safety net.
I realized that you need to strengthen those safety nets so that people can't fall through the cracks so easily.
Janet went into urban planning. She used the settlement money to pay for grad school. She now works for King County and helps citizens have a voice in the future of their neighborhoods. The moment when we learn that the world is not safe is a sobering moment that changes us forever, particularly if we bought into false narratives that by being good or exceptional, we are protected. Fantasies that the American dream can be for everyone. The settlement was a safety net for Janet at a moment when her world broke open. All of her beliefs had been challenged. The ideal that your parents know best, that you'll be treated fairly if you color within the lines and just follow the rules, that you'll be listened to and believed because you're a good person, and the ideal that in the U.S. the system is always just. The settlement gave Janet the freedom to see herself as an individual apart from her family and apart from her Korean American community. It gave her the opportunity to see the world with clear eyes and to choose her own path forward. Next week's object is a tatung cooker. 10,000 Things is produced by KUOW in Seattle, a member of the NPR network. Our host, writer, and creator is me, Xinyi Pai. Whitney Henry Lester produced this episode. Jim Gates is our editor. The show art is designed by Eason Yang. Original music is by Tomo Nakayama. Our production team includes Michaela Giannotti-Boyle, Hans Tweit, Amelia Peacock, Brendan Sweeney, and Marshall Eisen. If you like this podcast, KUOW has a lot more great audio for you. Search KUOW in your podcast app and see what piques your interest. KUOW podcasts are made possible through community funding. You can support 10,000 Things and other KUOW podcasts by making a donation of any size at KUOW.org. There's a link in the show notes. And as always, thanks for listening.
At Soundside, we bring you news and conversation rooted in the Pacific Northwest. Hi, I'm Libby Denkman. I think of my job hosting Soundside as, number one, asking tough questions of powerful people, the questions you, KUOW listeners, want answered. And two, bringing you a daily slice of the fascinating, confounding, and often goofy side of life in Washington State. Join me for Soundside at noon and 8 p.m. on KUOW or anytime on the Soundside podcast.